I want to begin by making sure that I thank everyone that is essential to making this program happen, including Emily Reiswag, who does the grant writing, that she re-grants the funding for events like this, and who is the director of a unique organization in the United States. This is the only organization that is composed of 41 different ethnic heritage museums and centers in the city. There is no such similar organization in Los Angeles, New York, anywhere else. And the Ethiopian Community Association, which I work with, is one of the core members. We have senior advisors coming from the Art Institute, the Field Museum, etc. I also want to thank the Ethiopian Community Association for Dr. Erku Yimmer, Director Aklilu Adeye, everyone in that organization who tolerates my busyness, my bright ideas that get us involved in events like this. I really appreciate having found you. And I also want to thank my collaborators, Sulon Moy from the Chinese American Museum of Chicago, whom we have worked with in the past with ECAC on Inherit Chicago programs, Kathleen McDonald, who cannot be with us tonight because of a family event, who is the director of the Mitchell, it's a lovely, both of their museums are lovely. The Mitchell Museum of the American Indian in Evanston on Central, I urge you to go there. They recently opened this past Friday a wonderful exhibit on Indian jewelry, and we hope to have an extension of this program with a panel, we don't know, travel to the Mitchell Museum in 2020. And also the Hellenic National Museum. It was unthinkable to me that there should be a program on repatriation of cultural patrimony and that in some way the Hellenic Museum not be involved. And so I thank all of you, and I think that the next thing I should do is thank our ECAC, Ethiopian Community Association, panelist and moderator, Zerai Alamseged, who is the Donald Pritzker Professor at the University of Chicago, where he teaches and researches on biological and cultural origins of our species. And he has established the Dika Project, which is in one of the valleys, I think, of the Great Rift Valley. And you can see in the handout his biographical notes. He was too modest to mention that when he was at Max Planck, Leipzig, he was part of an expedition to Ethiopia where he was, tell me if I'm exaggerating, discovered the bones of a more complete skeleton than Lucy, 150,000 years prior to Lucy, of a child who is known as Lucy's child, Salam. And also was, after Leipzig and Max Planck, was director of the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, the California Academy of Sciences. I first learned of him snooping at the identity of people who attended our Haile Gerima Carey Marshall program. And I saw his name and who he was, and I talked about him to Aklilu Adeye, etc. And so we were delighted to have him be our moderator tonight. But before we begin, I also wanted to make some comments about the idea for this program. I was looking at the New York Times in April 2018, and there was, in the culture, arts and culture section, and there was a photo of Theaster Gates, which drew my attention immediately. He's, great influence in Chicago and national culture. And next to it was an article pulled from the art newspaper about the Magdala treasures and that there was going to be an exhibit at the Victoria and Albert. And I didn't know anything about them. I had heard Emperor Theodorus's name, but I didn't know about the Magdala treasures. And just reading it, I went, oh my God, my husband and I are going to be in London while this is on for a week. And so the first week of May, we went to the Victoria and Albert. And I must tell you, I am sensitive to this issue because I'm a Greek girl. I'm an old Greek woman now, but when I was a Greek girl, the Parthenon and the Acropolis meant a lot to me. And my first trip to London was in 1966. And I went to the British Museum and the what we at the time called the Elgin's Marbles, and are now the better known as, more accurately described as the Parthenon Marbles, were overwhelming to me and made me angry. And I did not return to London until a few years ago, and I've been back multiple times since because it's a great city. And I got over my anger at the British Museum, but there are problems with that institution. And so when we were in London, every newspaper in the city, from the Rupert Murdoch papers to the Guardian to the Telegraph, the London Times, had articles about the Magdala treasures. And there was a lively debate, many advocating they should be returned to Ethiopia. They were taken under the circumstances of imperialist expedition and a colonial adventure. And it was so pre-planned that they had brought 2 archivists with them from the British Museum and the British Library so that they would take the best items back to England. And I could go on, but the main thing to tell you is that we are having this conversation at a time that I could not have known in May 2018, that we would subsequently have President Macron of France commission a report from Benedict Savoy, who was at the Humboldt Forum, and although she is a French woman, and Felwine Sarr, who is Senegalese, to assist him and direct him in how to repatriate the amount of cultural patrimony that is in the hands and in the control of the French museums throughout the country. 95% of Africa's cultural patrimony is not on the continent anymore. It is mainly in the great encyclopedic museums, which I love. I go to a city, the first thing I do is check out what are the exhibitions on, and I go. But there is so much that, as the report says, and as Macron has said, although he hasn't followed up, if a request is made, we will return items. And some things from Ethiopia are to be returned. A number of bronzes to Benin have been returned, and now it has slowed down some. I also could not have guessed that the Humboldt Forum would be moving into new quarters in Berlin this year, and that Germany would have to establish guidelines for repatriation of artifacts. And linking to the Mitchell Museum, I believe 9 artifacts that were not involved in any colonial enterprise, that were ended up in Germany, from Alaska, were repatriated to Alaskan tribes this year. And you could go on and on. You can look at the New York Times Arts and Culture section, and there are weekly stories from islands off of Chile to throughout Africa to Asia. And the thing that struck me that is the punchline here is that, I'm looking at this as a Greek, but this happens all around the world. All of our institutions have been, our museums especially, they are institutions of the Enlightenment. They perform a wonderful function, but their foundation and their core comes out of the imperial era and the colonial experience. And there are things there that people want to have home. Our economies around the world depend to a large extent on tourism, on people saying, well, when I go there, what can I do? What do I have to do? And one of the things you can do is go see what are the pride of peoples all around the world. And so return, when it is requested, is being seriously considered and is now a topic of great conversation. And even though there should be more people in this room, there are people in this room. Mr. James Kuno, who is the head of the Getty Foundation, is in this room. Tristram Hunt, who is the director of the Victoria and Albert, is in this room. Carrie James Marshall, who, when the Legler Library and the Chicago Public Library earlier this year was about to sell the painting that he had expressly painted for that library and for kids in the Lawndale neighborhood, was going to be sold off. He said, well, why does it always have to be my paintings? I understand you have money needs and budgetary needs. Why, if they're so bad, why not sell the Picasso statue? Why does it have to be my work? And so there is a growing awareness. There is more conversation. I think all of the conversation we're having about monuments and how people are represented in them have been influenced by the colonial outlook on racism, on imperialism, on a ranking of people that comes out of social Darwinism. And so welcome tonight. And Zerai, I'm through with my diatribe, and I'm ready for you to take over in more calm fashion. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Irene, for the wonderful presentation on many aspects of why we're here today. I should say that I really like your energy. Your emails, your phone calls are nothing but inspiring. So please keep it up. We like it. And today, people do need reminders, as you know. They're so tied up with so many things. You can open your phone and then you have an email. You have to read it before you can answer. There is another email. So what you do is actually irreplaceable. And of course, I would like to thank all of the people who've been involved in putting this together. We all know the amount of energy, time, and effort that goes into such events. So we don't take it for granted. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. And also we thank the hosts who made this space available. And I should also thank you, Irene, for the kind introduction. It was maybe an exaggeration, but I'll take it. Yeah, as Irene said, I'm from the University of Chicago, but today I'm here mainly due to my association with the Ethiopian Community Association in Chicago. And know that I have not done anything for this association, and I feel very honored today to be part of this event, and thanks them for identifying me to play this important role of moderating, or I would say facilitating the conversation between the three people who know more about repatriation, maybe myself. The Ethiopian Community Association in Chicago is a not-for-profit and non-political association which strives to really help those in need beyond and above just the Ethiopian community. Founded in 1984, they do active organization of events, including child and youth summer camp, language programs for children, organizing traditional festivals, even matching grant programs, developing exhibitions highlighting Ethiopian history, and these are just to name a few. So the association goes beyond even the traditional activities that many associations of such community do. Because of the Ethiopian Association, maybe a few facts about Ethiopia, if you don't know where it is. Ethiopia is a country in the Eastern Africa. It's the second most populous country in Africa, following Nigeria. There are over 110 million people in the country. I don't know if you have a picture of Ethiopia somehow. It may not be that. Maybe you're thinking of a small country, but we're talking about a big country. It's one of the ancient and most powerful empires in the world. Ancient civilizations that rival Egypt, Syria, and the risk of being shot by Irene, even Greek, I would add, Greece, I would add. Speaking of nationalism. And someone is next to me, and I think I'm putting myself in a very dangerous spot. But I think we're here gathered to celebrate heritage, and for me, as I elaborate, it's a combination of all those cultures that unites us as humanity and as human beings. close to my heart is, of course, Ethiopia is also the cradle of mankind, and I have contributed towards making that scientifically evident, as Irene mentioned. It's also the origin of coffee that every one of us sip in the morning, and we drink that. And Addis Ababa is not only the capital of Addis, but is the capital of Africa, because the headquarters of the AU is based there. As a result, it's, I think, the fourth or the fifth most diplomatic city in the world. So if you visit Addis, you will visit a big city. Maybe relevant to our story today, it's the only African nation that had never been colonized. And I underscore that because that's why then the country managed to maintain its heritage and culture for many millennia. As a result, when you visit Ethiopia, you will be struck by how African it is actually. So a combination of religion and long tradition of government, and this fierce sense of independence has preserved the heritage of the country. As a result, the country has inspired many African nations, but also the Black struggle in general, putting forward in the identity of people and the fights against colonial powers. So the country really features in that regard. And yet, despite that, however, a considerable number of the country's heritage remain unreturned, especially those that pertain to King Theodros that Irene alluded to earlier. King Theodros was king of Ethiopia from 1855 to 1868. Leader, really a pioneering leader who was ahead of his time, who tried to modernize the country. In the 19th century, when Africa was considered to be not only the black, but the dark continent. And because of some political differences with the British came to Ethiopia not to colonize, but to invade and then capture Theodros, who refused to do that and actually took his own life, which in the Ethiopian history remains a symbol of our independence and our national, I would say, integrity. And once that happened, then the British took a great deal, a vast amount of heritage that belonged to King Theodros himself, to the country, and also to the church. And most of them are now in many places in the UK. And we did have some returning, trickling here and there, but the vast majority of that heritage is now sitting in many museums and private collections in the UK. So I think such a conversation would help us think about the way to go forward and how we can actually, in a more civilized way, try to bring back that heritage to the country where they belong. But as these speakers will tell us in detail, heritage repatriation is a complex and multifaceted endeavor involving identity, politics, history, conservation, and finances. So it's not a matter of going pick up your heritage and go back home. That's more complex than that. I do believe, however, that most heritages, while they reflect aspects of a given society or a nation, they fall under the category of what I call humanities history. For me, heritage in Japan or in Congo or here in the native land of America, it belongs to humanity. Unless we connect those dots, then we won't make sense of what makes us human as a species, in my view. And yet, I also believe that heritage out of context will be less meaningful, if not meaningless. I think a good example of this one is when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1937. He removed a big 160-ton, 24 meters or 70-foot high monolithic obelisk. He removed it from Aksum in the northern part of Ethiopia and took it to Rome, where it stayed in some piazza for 68 years. And it was completely out of place until 2005, when the obelisk was returned to Ethiopia. So when we talk about repatriation, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not a matter of give me my money back. It's actually let's put things where they belong so they can make sense. So I think having said that, because we have the experts themselves here, my job today is to facilitate the conversation and make sure that we are on time and the process is going smoothly. With that, therefore, and with Irene's permission, I'm going to introduce the speakers today so they can tell us, they can reflect on repatriation and restitution based on their experience, and then maybe educate us so we can take actions that are pertinent to repatriation, wherever that repatriation may be happening. I think our first speaker is Eleanor Burstyn, who served as Associate Curator of Chinese Art at the Art Institute of Chicago from 1987 to 2017. And that happened following 10 years at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her gallery installations spanned Chinese jade, bronze, ceramics, prints, and paintings. Her publications focused on many of those subjects, as well as on the legacies of scholars and collectors who formed and advanced knowledge of American museums' collections. She currently works as an editor and independent scholar. And Eleanor holds a BA in Asian Studies and an MA in Art History and Museum Studies. So I'm going to let Eleanor tell us something about her work. And of course, she is from the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. So please take it away.
Does everyone have the handout, by the way? That'll save you some time. Okay, thank you. Is this okay?
Yep.
Okay. I think everyone realizes that the years since the founding of the People's Republic have witnessed very dramatic changes in the Western collecting of Chinese art, both in attitude as well as access. In China's quite rightful effort to safeguard its cultural heritage, two governmental organizations, the Ministry of Culture and the State Administration of Cultural Heritage, have imposed increasing restrictions on the buying and selling of what it calls its cultural relics. These, quite broadly defined as valuable works of art, quote-unquote valuable works of art and handicraft articles dating from various historical periods. This is what I mean by broadly. A bilateral agreement with the U.S. government signed in 2009 and last amended in January of this year, and this is, I have the website on your handout, has imposed especially strict import restrictions on materials designated as archaeological. That is datable from Paleolithic times through the 9th century, monumental sculpture and wall art that is at least 250 years old, and works of art potentially found underground or on inland waters or territorial seas. These are defined in a State Department website that is on your handout, and I think are worth reviewing for their extraordinarily wide-ranging content and scope. I'm not going to comment on the intricacies of this document or the logistics of its export procedures, which themselves have stimulated active discussions on both sides of the Pacific. But it has stimulated, I think, an increasing and quite necessary and overdue attention to issues of provenance by Western curators and collectors. Provenance is a word that can mean place of origin or history of ownership or both. It is this issue of provenance rather than the complexities of Chinese law that I would like to address. Provenance research was once the purely academic concern of museum curators and art historians. a desire to reconstruct the biographies of Chinese objects in Western collections. But for curators today, even every potential acquisition, whether by purchase, gift, or bequest, is now required to go through a far more urgent process, provenance review. The goal and responsibility is to document, insofar as possible, the object's biography, especially its prior owners and transfer of ownership. This research is painstaking, it is rigorous, and it is especially rigorous for works that may be defined as archaeological. It begins with permission from the dealer or private owner to begin the study. If permission is denied, the object is not considered. If permission is granted, that dealer is required to provide as many records as possible: photographs, previous collections, bills of sale, shipping documents, personal correspondence, publications, exhibitions, records, etc. But provenance research in Chinese art has been very underdeveloped relative to Western art. I show you on that handout some of the websites that are currently used by many museums and might be of use to private collectors as well. This detective work might begin with something as basic as a Google book search, which sometimes turns up free digital copies of old sale catalogs by eminent 20th century dealers. You might, for example, request a search database to discover whether an item has been registered as stolen, missing, subject to dispute, or reported with authenticity issues. These other websites that are listed on your database, for example, the Frank Caro C.T. Liu Archive. C.T. Liu, I should mention, was one of the most controversial dealers in the history of Chinese art. But he's a very two-sided figure. He was also a major donor to some of China's most eminent scholars. And he's viewed very, very differently in China, both in a positive and negative sense. And these archives are incredibly valuable. They require an appointment, but they do enable many museums to trace their objects back to the early 20th century. As far as the auction houses, the auction houses will not disclose the name of the buyer, but old auction catalogs will often have the names of the buyers penciled in. So it often is, you often are able to track down an object that you are considering for purchase consideration back to the early 20th century. So for museums, my point is that provenance research also can involve a lot more than acquisition. Curators are really responsible for documenting the history of ownership for objects that are within their collection, for documenting their biographies as well, regardless of when they were acquired. And it's these histories that we find can also be very intriguing. This, for example, this is a Chinese court official named Duan Fang, who was one of Imperial China's last and most renowned antiquarians and collectors. His personal collection was vast, it was wide-ranging, it was meticulously documented, with individual publications devoted to bronzes, jades, sculptures, paintings. His catalog of ancient bronzes illustrates more than 400 objects in woodblock printed line drawings. Each inscription is shown with a rubbing, reproduced with photolithography, a technique introduced from the West. In 1906, he visited Chicago and other American cities as part of a diplomatic delegation dispatched by the Empress Dowager, I should show you his photograph again, to survey American business, social, educational institutions. He visited, for example, Jane Addams at Hull House. He sent a stele as a gift to the Field Museum. In 1911, last year of China's imperial rule, Duan Fang was assassinated in China while attempting to quell a rebellion. His widow subsequently sold pieces from his vast collection to, among others, C.T. Liu. as I said, the most influential, in some ways, the most controversial dealer of Chinese art in the 20th century. In 1928, Kate Buckingham, one of the Art Institute's greatest patrons, purchased this tripod illustrated here from C.T. Liu. Oops, sorry. So here we have a very direct, very well-documented line of transmission to the Art Institute. By contrast, this small kneeling figure is an entirely different story. It came to the museum in 1950 as part of a large collection of jade formed by Edward and Louise Sonnenschein before Edward's death in 1935. Their source was completely unknown, and although we had reason to believe they had purchased it in China, we knew that it was not jade. Over the years, some had even questioned whether it was Chinese. It appeared to be completely unique until a group of virtually identical figures were discovered at this site in 2001, a site in far southwestern China, datable to the late 2nd millennium BC. But unlike those figures to the left and right, the Art Institute figure, these are a light yellowish gray stone, some of which preserve traces of pigment. The Art Institute example is smooth, shiny black, dark green stone. So questions about the nature of this surface, whether it was coated with a paint-like film darkened by heating, prompted a thorough investigation. With permission and cooperation of the archaeologists at Jinsha, conservation scientists at the Art Institute, their colleagues at Northwestern at Argonne National Lab, worked together with geologists at the Royal Ontario Museum, at the Smithsonian, to explain the relationship between the Art Institute figure and this recent find. The geologist at the Royal Ontario Museum was permitted to analyze the stones at Jinsha as well as in Chicago. And in brief, we were able to surmise that the Art Institute piece had likely been burned, polished, and in the 20th century, I can get back to it, impregnated with a modern wax, and that it had come from a site nearby and contemporaneous with the Jinsha finds. We then sent photos and a complete scientific report to the archaeologists at Jinsha, published another report and proceedings at an international conference hosted by the Smithsonian. It is these channels of communication with Chinese curators and Chinese archaeologists that are and must be kept increasingly open. Thank you.
Thank you,
I have nothing to do
Eleanor.
with this.
That's good. He's going to fix it. Thank you. Right on time. And that's very good. Speakers are given 10 to 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please just wait until the end. And our next speaker is Dr. Catherine Claydis, who is a resident scholar with the National Hellenic Museum. And she is a visiting assistant professor at DePaul University. She holds a BA in classics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in classics again from the University of London. Her academic interest ranges from Greek history to archaic periods to modern Greek American identity. Her research and teaching has included work at Frye University of Berlin. Is it Frye, right? Frye, yeah. The University of Oxford, the American University in Cairo, and the University of London. Dr. Claydis works in Latin, French, Spanish, Russian, Farsi, Arabic, and Greek. I myself speak 5 languages now. I feel very dwarfed by her. So, exactly. All right. So, and she is from the, as I said, National Hellenic Museum. So, Catherine, please take it away.
I need all the help I can get. So. Okay. Okay. Oh, here we go. Yep. I'm. So you gave me that impressive introduction. Now people expect me to know how to do things. Okay.
Yeah, they're good. And
There
then
we go.
you can, use this one
Okay,
here.
maybe she'll there. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to Irene and Jacqueline who who helped me get involved in this while I was in Georgia, the republic, not the state. So I know I wasn't always the most accessible person, so I apologize. So I want tonight to talk to you about the Parthenon Marbles, but I also think that the Parthenon Marbles are a way into talking about the repatriation of cultural heritage because of the unique place that Greece and Greek identity played in the history of colonialism, but not just the history of colonialism, but in the formation of the concept of the West. And so I think that the argument I'm making for the return of the Parthenon Marbles is not just one of ethnic pride, though you can imagine I have that. They don't just hand out all those vowels in a surname, but also because this Greek story of identity and heritage, both in the ancient and modern world, is unique in a way that it helps us understand the return of these objects, not just to Greece, but to other parts of the world as well, is not just about giving people their stuff back or making strange claims about the belonging of heritage that frequently rely on things like blood and territorial claims that can lead us down some very weird and potentially gross roads. It really is that things make sense in context, and that the shared heritage of humanity should be really shared. And in that sharing, we can do that through context, right? Through proper context. That tells us where to distribute these things. So I start with this image of the Parthenon, because the great temple to Athena on the Acropolis of Athens, which hasn't been in use for over 1,700 years, it survived Christendom, by the way, it survived the Christianization of the Roman Empire, is not just a symbol of Greece. It's a symbol of the West, perhaps, of civilization. If you Google civilization, this comes up like fourth on Google Images, which is weird, right? So to understand how we got here, and specifically about the Parthenon Marbles, there's a couple things I need the uninitiated crowd to know. The first is, while Greek is one of the world's oldest continuous linguistic traditions, Chinese might be first, but we're going to say Greek. It's a debate among linguists, but we're going with Greek, okay? And while there have been people who identify as Hellenes, probably from the 8th century BCE, the fact is there was no nation state of Greece until the second third of the 19th century, right? Greece doesn't gain its independence until 1832. The second thing to remember is that Greek-speaking people, while Greek culture was held in high esteem by the Romans, and by from Roman times, right? Greek people have actually been under colonial occupation for a much longer part of history than they've been independent. So the Greek-speaking lands, first, most of the traditionally Greek-speaking lands were in Asia Minor, which is today Turkey, not in Greece, right? In the 400 years before the formation of the Greek nation state, the Greeks most Greek-speaking people were under the Ottoman Empire, were ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And for the 1,000 years before that, most Greeks lived in the Eastern Roman Empire, which we, as another colonial imposition, call the Byzantine Empire. And modern Greek identity is not centered in the classical past. Modern Greek identity began to take shape in the middle of the Byzantine period as the Christian church fractured between Eastern and Western seas and was consolidated in the Roman Empire, where Hellenic identity was tied not to language. There were frequent attempts by the Ottomans to ban the Greek language, not by customs, but by religion. Any Christian in the Ottoman Empire was a Greek. right? So that's it. And the third thing I need you to remember as we talk about this is that despite the complexity of this sort of Western identity, Western Greek of Greece with the West, of the classical period, of Greek identity with the classical period, the fact is that during the Greek War of Independence, Greeks welcomed this association because it was the association with the classical past that brought money and arms support from the great Western powers to the Greeks in their struggle against the Ottomans. So let's talk about Elgin and his marbles. So the Parthenon marbles, which were once called the Elgin marbles, and I'm going to show you a picture of him if you don't believe this is about colonialism, represent about half of the surviving statues of the Athenian Parthenon. The statues were removed by Lord Elgin between 1801 and 1812, and this is important because he did have a permit, but Greece was still under the occupation of the Ottomans. The permit came from the Ottoman Empire. Also, it's important to remember that about 80% of the cultural patrimony that was removed, that's ever been removed from Greece, from the nation-state of Greece, was removed between the middle of the 18th century and Greek independence in 1832. What this coincides with is the Enlightenment. It's in the Enlightenment, not only in the Age of Imperialism, but it's in the Enlightenment that the idea of the West begins to take shape. And in that taking shape, Greece becomes, in the minds of Enlightenment thinkers, the cultural origin point of the West. So it's in that time that Phil Hellings, these Enlightenment thinkers from France, from Britain, this is really the beat up on British program, in truth, from France, from Britain, from the United States, come to Greece and start to remove its cultural patrimony under the auspices of a dying Ottoman Empire, who was already the sick man of Europe, who is receiving fees as this is being shipped out. Since Greece has gained its independence in 1832, they have made active efforts to recover their art, their lost art and artifacts. So this has been something that's been going on in the Greek state, despite the real troubles of the Greek state, I think we can say honestly. From the very beginning, they've been seeking to return their artifacts. If you've not been to the British Museum to see the Parthenon marbles, I invite you all to go. They're there. I checked during my PhD. I checked when I was there last March for a wedding, too. So there's the Parthenon marbles. Here's some of the friezes that were taken as well. Once again, the pictures don't serve them justice. Also, if you go to the not new anymore, but the Archaeological Museum in Athens, you can see the missing spots that have been left by the Greek government for their return. And if we want to argue about whose government's more stable to keep them, I think the British are making a harder and harder argument these days. So. And just really quickly, before we get to the meat of the talk, this is Lord Elgin. So if you don't think this is about colonialism because Greece is in Europe, look at that guy. That's a colonizer. Okay. Who dresses like that? Okay. So let's talk really quickly in my last few minutes about Greece as a colonial subject. So this part, the Parthenon, as not just belonging to the Greeks, but to the world, right? Our Supreme Court building. Greece is our origin. And we hear things like Lord Byron's poem, The Glory That Was Greece. But what does this mean? I love this, right? Modern Greece is history's sole witness of the consequences of the colonization of the ideal. And Greece as Europe's both origin and other, and you saw this so much in the debate around the Greek economic crisis, right? So Greece is both the stable place of the West's identity formation, right? If you took a class in Western civilization, 15 years ago, they would hand you a book and have you start learning about Greece. Not about Byzantine Greeks, but the refined classical whitewashed Greeks. But by being constructed as the cradle of Western civilization, Greece is frozen in time. And this activity, this fact, right, this fact that ignores everything modern Greeks think about themselves, right? If you go and ask modern Greeks, Greek Americans, go ask some people at the restaurant down the street, and you ask them what it means to be Greek, the first thing they're going to probably mention is their Orthodox Christian identity, right? That has nothing to do with the classical past. They're going to talk about the Greek nation state. They're going to talk about Greek dancing and foods that have their root in the Ottoman Empire. But by being frozen in the past and constructed as pre-modern, modern Greeks and modern Hellenism can erase modern Greek identity, and in doing so, erase modern Greek claims to their own cultural patrimony. And I think this is important because it's not just important for Greeks, but the Greek circumstance that's so unique, right? That's so unique because Greece is also idealized, it's historically idealized, gives away, draws back and makes clear the ways in which colonialism is really about rewriting and reshaping the past. And while most colonial subjects end up having their past diminished as a way of conquest, what happened in the Greek case is the past has been exalted in such a way that it robs the people of their past. The people are robbed of their past not by its diminishment, as we see happen with, for example, indigenous people frequently, but people are robbed of their past by its exaltation. And so returning the Parthenon marbles, I think, is not just about returning to Greece what belongs to them. The Parthenon marbles belong to the city-state of Athens, which no longer exists and has not existed since Alexander the Great take it up with him. It's about reclaiming what Hellenism really is, which the Enlightenment thinkers got partially right, right? Hellenism is about the idea that our humanity is shared in common, though our customs and places may vary, and that we share that humanity through its most pure expressions, which are art and philosophy. And so I think we can reclaim Hellenism and reclaim a language of talking about the return of cultural patrimony that's not caught up in strange 19th century ideas of race and blood. And we can really create a conversational cultural patrimony that is far more holistic in that way. So, and I look forward to talking to you all about this later.
Thank you, Catherine. You are on time too. For yes.
That is a victory for the Greek.
That's right. Wait until you visit Ethiopia. Okay, thank you. Our third speaker is Jody Simkin from the Mitchell Museum of American Indian. Am I wrong?
Yes, you are. In the Clues First Nation in British Columbia.
Okay, I was said that information. Okay, but I do have the information below, so I will read what I have now. The title was mistaken. I apologize, obviously. So Jody is the director of the Cultural Affairs and Heritage for the Clubhouse First Nation. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you after every sentence now. Which is located in central British Columbia. The nation has undertaken the development of a systematic framework for research, location, and repatriation of ancestral remains and related cultural patrimony. A lifelong advocate for social justice, Jody is also the vice president of the British Columbia Museum Association and appointed member of the Association on American Indian Affairs Repatriation Working Group. Jody is a past presenter for the Federation of International Human Rights Museum and the Learned Society. She is also an inductee in the Golden Key International Honor Society. I hope all of that is right, but that's what I was given. Jody, please indulge us with your beautiful presentation.
I'm going last because I'm going to be the longest, I'm afraid. So I'll see you going like this. It's time to get off.
I'll give you 2 extra minutes because I
Okay. Oh, it worked. So before I start, as a representative of the Clues First Nation, it's very customary for us to acknowledge the traditional territory of the nation or nations that we're meeting on. So I do that without the knowledge of whose nations and whose traditional lands we're meeting on, but with all respect and in a good way so that we just pause to acknowledge that we're on someone's traditional territory. We're going to talk about two very specific projects today, the Journey Home, which is the search for the ancestors of the Klahoose Nation, and the Mountain and the Mouse, which is a technology project that will help support repatriation efforts across Canada. We frame this inside of a conversation that's more historical, because if I was just to come and talk to you about the missing ancestors, you wouldn't get how that all comes into play. So we're going to spend some time looking at the historical framework and then talk very specifically about the projects themselves. The first place to start is that Canada is huge, second in landmass only to Russia. There are 3 oceans or bodies of water that surround us, and we have, of course, the largest undefended border in the world between the United States and Canada. There are a number of First Nations, over 600 First Nations from coast to coast, 203 of those in British Columbia alone. And what's significant about this is, sort of in the timeline of events, is on the far eastern coast, represented in green here, all the way to the pink province of Alberta, there are numbered treaties. So the colonial government, during the expansion process and the arrival of Europeans, struck numbered treaties across the country. They get to British Columbia and they have no money. And the cornerstone of colonial policy is cash payment, as well as an articulation of what responsibilities come with the settling of those treaties, things like education, housing, health and welfare. So British Columbia heads to Confederation in 1871 without a single treaty, which means there has been no extinguishment of Aboriginal rights and title. There is one single piece of legislation which governs Indians in Canada from 1871 through to the present day, called the Indian Act. And although the rights to Aboriginal title were not surrendered, that legislation still governs the 203 First Nations of British Columbia. Now, there are no treaties. There is a modern treaty process, which started about 30 years ago. I think it was 34 years ago. But it's incredibly slow and painstaking, and they have settled only 7 treaties at this point. It's a voluntary process. The Klahoose Nation is in stage 4 treaty, which means a treaty in principle that is suspended as the various parties look at the elements of the treaty to decide if it is in fact the way to move forward. But that difference is fairly significant. About 4 years ago, the Chilcotin decision, which was the Chilcotin First Nation of British Columbia, who went against the Supreme Court and said, we don't believe we extinguished our Aboriginal rights and title. And for the first time in Canadian history, the courts agreed. So that changes the premise of how we look at what has happened in British Columbia and what continues to happen. When we're talking about the Klahoose Nation, we're talking very specifically about a very small nation in central coast of British Columbia, represented by that long dotted line. The Klahoose Nation is the most northern Coast Salish nation. It is 4 sister nations: the Klahoose, the Homolko, the Sliammon, and the Comox. These were independent nations that were bound together by a common dialect, and so we see early Europeans start to amalgamate them into one single entity, which makes repatriation incredibly complicated. We now have a subclassification called Malaspina, or mainland Comox, which makes no distinction among the nations themselves. The traditional territory expands 480,000 hectares, but in the 1800s, the community was ushered into 10 reserves that occupied just over 1,300 hectares, so less than 1% of the original land mass. And so that land is still being contested today. We have a small population of about 425 or 30 people. That population prior to European contact would have been over 10,000. I apologize to all the historians in the room, but this is the quickest version of history you'll ever see. And it's really designed because you need to understand that the arrival of Europeans on the west coast of British Columbia doesn't happen until the 1700s. And exploration into the Quebec Valley happened in the 1500s. By the 1700s, there is establishment of fort cities, there's European populations across the country, and we're just starting to see the arrival of Europeans into the west coast. By 1862, 1 in every 3 Indigenous persons in British Columbia dies because of the epidemics, and that's population decimation we never recover from. The other thing that's important is that we see the introduction of the residential school period in 1880. The last residential school in British Columbia in Canada doesn't close until 1996. So incredible legacy of the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their homes, and with the direct intent of assimilation and acculturation of the cultural identity of those communities. We don't see the vote come until 1960, and the cultural ban, which has really the most to do with the repatriation work that is happening in British Columbia, was the potlatch ban. So we see the introduction of the residential school period, the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their home, but then there's this acknowledgement that the children can't return back to the home community if they're still potlatching, if they're still participating in the traditional economy. So we see the introduction of the bans in 1884. They last until 1951, incredibly long duration, 67 years, in which the practicing of cultural activities is entirely banned and a jailable offense. So they banned the powwow, the Sundance, and the sweat lodge, which are all important aspects of culture. But the only one that has to do with social governance is the potlatch, and it controls everything. It controls the hierarchy, the status, all the songs and dances. The communities are stratified, so access to hunting and fishing is all connected to that cultural identity, which is now banned. When the ban is lifted in 1951, you couldn't hire a lawyer for the purpose of pursuing land claims without going to jail. And no more than 3 Indians congregating for any purpose is a jailable offense. There's no giving or receiving of gifts of any kind, because the potlatch was centered on the idea that as witness to what we are offering, what we're telling you, we offer you a gift that correlates to your status. That's off the table. So really it has had a detrimental effect on how potlatch communities, and you only find the potlatch along the coast between Alaska and California, it has had a detrimental effect, continues today, the legacy of that. So I apologize to the historians as I skim over all the history in between that. So when we're talking about the 2 community cemeteries that we're going to talk about in a minute, Toba Inlet is at the far, far right. Squirrel Cove, which is the main village site for the Klahoose Nation, is in the middle. Anybody know where Victoria is? I see lots of nodding heads. Anybody know where Nanaimo is? Okay, so 2 hours from Victoria is Nanaimo, 2 hours from Nanaimo is Campbell River, and that's represented by that orange dot. So just to give you an idea, Vancouver Island is fairly big, and the coastal corridor is also big. So how we knew there was a problem? Pretty simple. We went to the cemeteries and looked, and there just wasn't enough graves based on population census estimates. The church pitches up here in about 1800, and by 1884, traditional burials have really been replaced by European-style burial, European cemeteries. So up until that point, the burials would have been in the cave or in trees, and by 1884, we see the cemetery start to be used. So we have roughly 130 years of continual use. So that is the beginning of the journey home. We decided that we would do underground penetrating radar, so non-destructive, non-invasive technology that would run over the surface of the cemetery to determine whether or not there were remains in the cemetery that were currently not visible from the surface by looking. So we're in the West Coast, everything rots, so it's possible that we had some remains that were not properly marked and just didn't get new crosses. But what we found, we were quite surprised by. So Toba Inlet is a very small cemetery, very isolated still. You have to take a boat to get there, 2 boats actually. There was only, I think, 3 marked observable graves in the cemetery, and we were able to infer an additional 39 graves, so 39 sets of remains that were previously unknown. In terms of the Squirrel Cove Cemetery, which is very big, there was 204 observable graves, 36 with headstones, and we found an additional 98 sets of remains. So a combined total that really was more than we had anticipated. So this is the Toba Inlet Cemetery. All the dots, we had put up an arbitrary fence line, and you can see that we have some human remains that appear outside of the cemetery boundaries. If you've never seen ground penetrating radar equipment, it looks like a lawnmower, but it's much fancier than that. Over there. The technicians get really mad when that's how we describe it. And this is the Squirrel Cove Cemetery, very large, expansive cemetery. And it happens exactly the way that it should. All the dots on red, which are on the far right side, were previously unknown. But that's because the cemetery was full. And so nobody replaced the graves, and somebody in the community remembered. But when we did the underground penetrating radar, we could see clearly that the use evolves as it should. The farthest end of the cemetery was used, and then we're in the blue section is the mid part, and we're now using the purple section. What was interesting was the radar actually exposed for us a trench burial in the red section, which had very purposely placed graves. So unlike mass burials in which they're indiscriminately placed inside of the burial, these graves were people put very purposely, and we still aren't sure why that happened. It's about 6 feet from the surface. We can see them placed in the ground, but we have no explanation for why that's so. I'll just tell you that ground penetrating radar, if you look at it like a layer cake, and the top of the layer cake is the Earth's surface, and 6 or 7 layers below that. If you cut out a slice, you would see sort of a squiggly line, and that line tells you that there were human remains there. The far more interesting and valuable tool for us is when the ground-penetrating radar includes satellite survey images. So when we're looking down, the Earth's surface is still, of the layer cake is still gray, but any place there's been human remains, it turns lime green. And while we can't attribute each of those sets of remains to any specific person, it does tell us whether they're adults or children. It can tell us how they're articulated in the ground, so all sorts of things come out of the radar itself. So we have 130 years of continual occupation. We estimate that 5 people per year die, which is incredibly low, considering the epidemics, and we're a marine community, so when we have marine casualties, there's more than 1 person that dies generally. So you times those 2 numbers together, you get 650 sets of remains, and of course we're nowhere near that. We're at the 300, just at the 300 plus figure. So we know that there have been remains that are taken. And we also know that this is not something that happened in a faraway time. So we excavated this past year 4 sets of graves that had all been grave robbed. And the problem is that in traditional communities, the dead were buried with their treasures, with their box of treasures, to ensure that they had enough to get them to the next place that they were going. So lots of silver, lots of cedar, the most beautiful pieces reflective of one's status in life was their status in death. So we know that we're missing several hundred sets of remains, and what do we do now? Because where are the ancestors? We actually, as many Indigenous communities do, believe that the root of this starts at the doctrine of discovery, that if you're not Christian in life, the colonizers didn't care that you were Christian in death. So they took your remains, and they were really not more apologetic than that. So we also know that there's lots of anthropologists and people who just do bad things and they take them. And we also look at this like it's a foreign problem. But as I was chatting this morning with someone who said, we just learned of a politician in northern British Columbia who purchased for her boyfriend a human skull as a birthday present. And when she was called out on it, she said, I have nothing to apologize for. I bought this legally. I bought this without understanding that the purchase of a human skull would just be offensive to 1 million people. So, not a foreign problem at all. So the journey home is really a 3-stage project. We did the underground penetrating radar. We then created a database that had 500 institutions on it, which we think is a lot, but there are 55,000 museums around the world. These just happen to be the museums we believe have the highest chance of holding ancestral remains and cultural patrimony belonging to the nation. The elders in the community gave us very clear direction that until the ancestors had been brought home, that we could not move forward in looking for material culture that belonged to the nation, that in Indigenous communities there's a responsibility, an inherent responsibility, that we need to bring the ancestors home so that the children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are not still dealing with this sacred obligation. So we created this database, which is available to any First Nations community in North America to use, and we then created a very comprehensive community profile right here, and I have some copies if anybody is interested, that helps you understand if you're in Cairo or you're in Halifax or you're in Los Angeles. It will give you an understanding of who the Klahus Nation is and what we're trying to do. And then circulating all of that information out to the museums themselves. That led us to a secondary challenge, because all of a sudden we had satisfied that, and that work was completed this spring, to a secondary challenge, which is, how do we find the rest of the cultural patrimony that is connected to the potlatch? There's no central list, there's no central agency, nobody has any idea where it went, who it went from, and that's just from the government part, never mind the sales that happened under duress under the same period of time. So we know that the potlatch ban was 67 years. Over that 67 years, there were literally thousands and thousands of pieces that have found their way away from the community. So that led us to the development of The Mountain and the Mouse, which is a progressive mobile web app, which means you don't go to the Apple or the place you normally get your apps from. You can actually download it directly from the program website. And this allows any person, all of you sitting in this room, to download the app for free. There are a number of participating First Nations involved in this project, as well as the Royal British Columbia Museum, the Museum of Anthropology, and the Museum of Vancouver, the 3 largest cultural institutions in the province of British Columbia. And essentially, you walk into a museum and you see a piece that belongs to one of the participating nations. You just fill in a bunch of populated fields and hit send, and it submits it back to a map that creates lovely graphic images, and that is left up to the individual nations to work through the repatriation themselves. So there's no cost on the part of institutions, no part on the cost of the First Nations participating. The goal of the project is to have every First Nation in British Columbia who wants to participate to provide the opportunity for them to do so. And once British Columbia has satisfied that obligation, we will open the project to all of Canada. So a fantastic way to exponentially increase the number of people working on your repatriation without actually adding any pressure or additional work for the communities themselves. I will say just before I get to the end that NAGPRA does not apply in Canada. So there is no national strategy on cultural repatriation. This piece of legislation, the National Strategy on Aboriginal Cultural Property Repatriation, is before the government right now. It's in second reading. It's the worst piece of legislation. There's no mandated obligation on the part of institutions to connect with the First Nation when they're holding ancestors or related cultural patrimony to return it. We often look at this legislation with its nice words that say things like, we encourage museums, and we said it's very Canadian, it's just missing the word please in front of all of those things. So it's not law yet, and the Klahoose Nation will be filing a motion against this as well. So now you've heard our story. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's by the author Thomas King, who is also an activist. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Cry over it. Get angry. Forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if you've heard it. You've heard it now. So in closing, I will say I have one more piece of business. So one of the things that we do as the Klahoose Nation every year is when the community would gather and somebody would be building their big house, they couldn't do that alone. They couldn't do that with their own family. So they would call all of the people in the community together, and anybody who put their hands into that building, into the building and the raising of the poles, was gifted a piece of the most important blanket or the most important hide that they had. So we have reenacted this very sacred tradition. We take the most expensive blanket we have, which is a Pendleton blanket, and we every year cut it up. And when we do our annual pilgrimage on tribal journeys and we potlatch for 2 or 3 weeks down the coastal corridor of British Columbia, we gift pieces of our blanket to every single community so that we acknowledge the role that they play in helping us rebuild our house. So tonight we honor the museum, and I'll ask Jan to come and collect this piece of blanket. We gift our piece of blanket to you in providing the opportunity to come and share our story with you and with everyone here. And we hope that you cut it up into 1 million pieces and give it to people who want it. We love walking into museums and seeing pieces of our blanket, and we love to see them on people's briefcases, and they show up on all sorts of places. But we acknowledge the role that you play in helping us build our house and sharing our story and in helping us bring our grandmothers home. So, emote, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you. Thank you, Jody. Also on time. Thank God you had the extra 2 minutes. That works. All right. So the next is, as I said, we're going to open later for Q&A. But before that, I am going to ask the speakers. Please stay here. Not yet. I'm going to ask the 3 speakers if they have questions for each other, so we can enrich the conversation based on their specific experience. I have learned a few important things from each. I think Eleanor highlighted the importance of provenance research in keeping record, because without a record and without provenance, any heritage would be meaningless. And Catherine really delved into the importance of returning heritage. And I do concur with her when she emphasized that when you bring back your heritage, as I said, it's not just a matter of bringing back your object. It carries a lot with it, which pertains to the point of context I made in my introduction. And then Jody delved into the First Nation issues and related to repatriation and how we actually deal with human remains, which is an important topic, both practically but also symbolically, I would say. If you were a paleoanthropologist like myself, and you were to look at what makes us human, and you were to look at the key characters that occurred at different times, bearing your body is uniquely human. You won't find any other species, how smart they are, that bears its dead. So that is as much symbolic as it is a practical problem. And it really pertains to people who are out there like you and I. So it's something that really requires more attention beyond just legislation and then the scientific research. So I will then pass the mics. You already have mics, but then I was told to ask you if you had questions for each other based on what you've heard, and then after that we will open the conversation to the audience. Who wants to go first?
I have a comment question, I suppose, because I was really struck and sort of moved, and tried not to cry in front of you all because I have a lot of mascara on, in this conversation around human remains, because I think, so within sort of the Greek experience, one of the things that happened at Greek independence, because the Allies were so fixated on the classical past, is that a lot of the graveyards that had been used throughout the Byzantine and Ottoman periods were abandoned to the modern Turkish state. Essentially, a lot of the Christian graveyards of Asia Minor were abandoned to the modern Turkish state and were looted. Because the British and the French largely traded away those sites for classical sites, for like the Temple of Poseidon, which they thought were much more important, not our graveyards. And this has real consequences because today, during the refugee crisis, you can learn about more of that in the National Hellenic Museum in the gallery across the hall, as refugees, predominantly Muslim refugees, were pouring into Greece, people were dying, obviously. It's an incredibly treacherous journey. And there was there was only one Muslim cemetery in Greece at the time, 5 years ago, and there was a vitriolic reaction about creating a cemetery to bury the refugees because of what had happened to Greek graves, predominantly ethnically Greek graves, but Christian graves generally in Turkey, during the formation of the modern Turkish state. And so I think, and when that debate was going on, I think one of the things that we missed, a really missed opportunity, was to talk about what's happened in indigenous communities around the world, around human remains, because I think that's where the real pioneering work on doing that is. So I guess that was more of a statement. My question is, can you solve our problem for us?
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. So I think that one of the challenges we have is that we also have museums where we're not providing adequate training and understanding for the care of Indigenous remains. So we were doing some research looking for something else, and the museum that we had contacted said, oh, by the way, we have 2 sets of your people. Do you want to come and get them? As if that was a question. So we went to the museum, we traveled with a delegation, and we got there and they had done everything right. They had made sure that there was food. They had an elder that we could blanket to acknowledge and thank them for the care of the ancestors. These 2 particular ancestors would have been gone close to 70 years from the community. And after lunch, we were led into a small room where we were going to make the transfer. So we transfer from the whatever banker's box kind of thing that the ancestors have spent their life in to cedar boxes that come from the community, and we have cedar in them, and we have a very regimented way. We look at the care of ancestors. We take all of the material that accompanies that ancestor, all the paperwork from the museum. It all goes into the box with tobacco and cedar, and we seal the box right in place. It's a very sacred responsibility we have for caring for the ancestors, And we were so impressed by what this museum had done to accommodate us and to make sure that we had everything we needed to do the repatriation properly and in a good way, that the elders who were traveling with us welcomed the group from the museum to join us in this very small room and to witness what was about to happen. And we got in there, and there was a box on the table with a white tablecloth on it. And we pulled the tablecloth off, and these people had really spent a lot of time trying to make sure that they have cared for us in the way that was culturally appropriate. And what we saw was a box that had been put together with packing tape, and a black Sharpie had marked across the box the word skull. And you could hear the room, the air be sucked out of the room. Every ounce of goodness that the museum had done before that moment was taken away because they were so disrespectful for how the care of the final care and moments of that ancestor's journey home had been. So I think just in general, we need to be providing greater training so that cultural training is where we find the greatest strength in the institutions. When we tell people what they're caring for is sacred to the communities, it takes years for repatriations to happen. It takes more than years for international repatriations to happen. That in the interim, people who are stewarding Indigenous material culture have to be better informed and better educated.
Would you like to make a comment, Eleanor?
Could you say something more about these treasure boxes?
So the question is about treasure boxes.
Yeah.
Treasure boxes, they're cedar boxes. They accompany burials. They still accompany burials. And so in stratified communities, the pieces that are in your burial box, so lots of silver or gold, lots of cedar, all indicative of the status you had in life, had to be reflected in the burial boxes. So often that's what the Europeans were looking for. They started their colonial treasure hunt, and they took whatever parts of the remains, mostly the skulls, and then they removed the treasure boxes that accompanied them.
So Jody, just a follow-up on that. If there was a proper care and respect for the body, would you still accept that human remains could be used for research? Like, at the university, we use human cadavers to study medicine. So how do we train medical students in that
So
case?
I think that those are very different. I think somebody who is giving consent to have their body used in that mechanism is much, much different than having your grandmother exhumed without community consent and without community knowledge. And there is absolutely just zero tolerance for institutions which are holding human remains and are not interested in repatriating them. The British Columbia Museum Association, just in the coming weeks, will issue a call to action for all provincial museum associations to support the return of uncontested human remains back to the nations from where they were taken. These were horrific acts of disturbing people in the last moments of their existence and removing them from the ground. In the case of the Klahoose First Nation, the community was taught that only your immediate family was to touch the remains. So it was an incredible personal affront when the remains were handled by Europeans who were stealing them. So it wasn't just that they were taking them away from the community, it's that they violated the cultural codes that that told us how we were to look after the humans. So no, just no.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments from the podium? Well, I guess we can then open the Q&A session. So who has questions for any of the speakers or just a general question? Any questions? Well, come on, they said many exciting and interesting things. All right, over there.
So one anecdote and then a question that we were just talking about. I'd like to delve into it a little deeper. So there's a wonderful story about Jesse Jackson in an airplane leaving Paris and looking out on that incredibly rich city and the rich countryside around it and saying to his seat companion, "This is all from Africa." And I don't think that's 100% true, but it certainly reverberates in a very important way. even before you two talked, I wanted to pose the question to you that I didn't quite get the answer to, I think. So it seems to me that there is a sharp contradiction between the paleoanthropologist spending 11 years unearthing that skeleton of Lucy, that they call the daughter of Lucy, for scientific examination. And on the one hand, that's not Indiana Jones and grave robbing at all. I don't think. But I think you may. I didn't quite understand, but did you say that any scientific examination is like cultural abomination? Is like, no. It's okay. So.
No, so I think, just to clarify, so when we're talking about ancestral remains, we're talking about the removal of human remains from their final resting place without any knowledge of the community. That's vastly different than science and the collection of human remains or the use of human remains for science. So that would be akin to me going to the cemetery where someone's grandmother was and digging the grandmother up and then saying, well, I'm going to take the skull and I'm going to put it on display and I'm going to take the other parts of the body and do whatever I want or discard them. We don't support that at all. And so what we're talking about is the return of ancestral remains which were taken from the community, not just the Klahus Nation. This is a common problem among all First Nations in Canada and among all First Nations in America as well, where people, for whatever reason, using sort of the veil of the doctrine of discovery about Christianity to suggest that because the communities whose dead they were unearthing were not Christian in life, they were not Christian in death, and thereby taking them was a non-issue. You have scientists who wanted to do, so by the time the epidemics hit British Columbia, the scientific community wants to know what the inferior gene is in First Nations people, that they're succumbing to the diseases that Europeans brought. They had no immunity to those diseases. So you have the scientific community under this sort of very thin veneer of doing scientific legitimate work in trying to figure out what the differences are. You have anthropologists who just thought it was cool to have human remains, and then you have looters who are looking for the treasure boxes, who are looking so that they can expropriate the treasures out of those treasure boxes and sell them for profit. So it's, I think, for me, vastly different than scientific exploration and even the scientific work that you're speaking of in terms of what happens when someone donates their body to science. That's something that someone is giving consent to. In the case of ancestral remains, there was no consent given, and the remains were just taken. I hope that clarifies.
Well, just one for the follow-up. When you say ancestral remains, do you refer to like a living, continuous community that's been in touch with those graves, or something really ancient where the ancestral community hasn't been there for a long time, like Lucy, for example. There's nobody who has a good claim, I don't think.
So we're talking mostly for us, so for the Klahus Nation, we're talking about the ancestors of Klahus. So these are people that were taken, so in the graves that we just excavated last year, those would have been taken in the last 70 or 50 years, somewhere in that time frame. Those are the remains that we're looking for. We're looking for the remains that were taken out of the graveyards. We're looking for the remains that were taken out of the caves and burial boxes that litter the landscape of the Klahus traditional territory. They're everywhere. We're in a small isolated place. There are burial islands all over the countryside, and so those are the remains we're looking at. And again, very different because we have direct descendants of the people whose remains have been taken. So.
I want to go back to Greece for a moment and just ask Catherine a little bit more about where we are politically in a case like the Parthenon Marbles, which is just such a huge worldwide issue. What's happening, like politically? What can be done? Is there any pressure to be put to bear?
Yeah. So there have been several sort of false starts to this, obviously. And And Greece's 20th century history has not helped, right? It has given, the first time Greece went bankrupt, by the way, was in 1890, when the loans from the War of Independence were called in, so within 70 years. And then it was essentially occupied by the British, then it was occupied by the Germans. If anyone's would have told them this, right? And then then there was a military dictatorship, and then there was basically the early 21st century. 2014 was the last serious effort. The United Nations, UNESCO offered to mediate between the British Museum and the Greek government, and the British Museum agreed and then pulled out, saying that UNESCO's job was to mediate between governments, not between governments and museum trustees, which is an excuse. The current leadership at the British Museum, in my opinion, this is very much my opinion, and there are other opinions that could be had. My guess is they are reluctant to return the Parthenon Marbles or to engage in a negotiation with an EU government. So most of the stuff they stole from non-EU member states. In the lead up to, before Brexit, I think they were nervous about engaging with an EU partner because EU human rights law would start to control that negotiation. Brexit takes that off the table, but the reality is, I don't know the last time any of you were in the British Museum, if they start returning stuff, the British Museum will instantly become much smaller. They can't set that precedent. Now in 2015, they loaned several of the statues to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. This caused a huge uproar. They, of course, won't loan them to Greece, obviously. That they were now loaning out these objects that basically everyone agrees should not be there. Furthermore, there were British companies involved in 2009 and 2010 during the Greek bankruptcy. This is like a list of like things that make Greeks angry, but in the Greek bankruptcy, Greece was pressured by German and German-British negotiators to sell off cultural heritage sites as to private companies, to private tour operators, as part of paying their debts. And then those cells, which were pressured from the Western governments, were used by the British Museum as one of their reasons why they would not return the Parthenon marbles, for fear that they would be sold to pay debts.
Okay, so we'll bring it back to China now. At the end of your presentation, you sort of touched on the importance of maintaining open channels and connections with Chinese counterparts in order to make sure museums can continue to display Chinese artifacts. And I think on both sides of the Pacific, we've had difficulty, particularly in the past 2 years, with our general relationship with China. And in particular, I know of several people who haven't been able to get their visas back into the US because they're scholars doing science. And then the other way around, I know of people who are seeing more restrictions on how they can present objects from China and the US. And so I just wonder, what are the key strategies for maintaining good relationships with our counterparts in China?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I have not encountered that. We've had, very, very good relations, largely through the University of Chicago, with archaeologists, art historians, at the Art Institute. This work we did with this small kneeling figure, and there was never any suggestion of returning it to China. That the issue just never came up. This geologist that I referred to at the Royal Ontario Museum is someone who's been doing excavation work in China, and he knew these people who were excavating the site at Jinsha were his colleagues. So he requested permission to analyze the pieces there. Yes, there have been visa problems insofar as people attending conferences. But I just have no experience with that. No, it's an issue, academically, definitely. And as far as restitution, I had not encountered that with pieces at the Art Institute. But the Art Institute also did not have pieces that were obviously from major sites. I'm trying to think. I mean, if you walk into the galleries, there's a large Buddhist Triad, for example, if you may be familiar with it. That came in about 1930 with a receipt saying that it had come from a particular Buddhist temple, from a particular prefecture in a particular province, from this dealer. That temple has never been found in any literary record. And I have shown that receipt to every scholar that has come from China, whether the dealer made that up, whether there was a stele there that was since subsequently removed, we don't know. But our approach has been to give the scholars from China every bit of information we have, to give them every photograph we have, in the hope that they can provide us with, with shared information.
I think that highlights the dealer who may have made up a temple. I think highlights the sort of undercurrent of this that I don't think got expressed explicitly, which is the sell from really the 18th century onward with connoisseurship. The market in cultural heritage is a huge undercurrent to all this. That a lot of things have fallen. Museums are part of the story, certainly, but a lot of these things have fallen into private hands in private collections, and then people, either don't know they have them or don't care they have them. The story I always tell is the oldest extant manuscript of St. Augustine's Confession, which was held by the Vatican for most of the Middle Ages, we're pretty sure. So it's not like some slouchy institution, right? In Italy, which is in Europe with white people, which tends to help with these things, right? So the things don't get stolen. It still got stolen and ended up in a private collection. It went missing in the 1400s, and it got found in the 1970s. Because it just ended up in some German guy's library. And if you talk about something that's probably cultural heritage that's protected more than others, an Italian manuscript of St. Augustine commissioned by the Vatican is about as privileged as you get. But it was worth a lot of money, so.
Thank you. I think this all speaks to Jody's point of the importance of legislation and associated issues of making sure that they're enforced. I do field work in many parts of the world, from Chile to Kenya, and, South Africa, Ethiopia, and countries have a different way of handling the situation. Like in Ethiopia, you cannot sell or buy any fossil. That could be an elephant or a snail. You can't just buy or sell it. It's illegal. In some places, you can even sell. I was shocked to hear that someone bought a human skull and gave it to someone. That would be, I think you mentioned that, right? Yeah. So I think it really pertains to how we do our legislation and how we enforce them.
Well, and I think as well, it speaks to an appetite that we have as museum goers. So 45 million people have seen body worlds since it came, the plasticized cadavers. Institutions go to great lengths to bring Egyptian mummies to their public for the prestige, for the admittance, for all of those things. And fundamentally, we're still looking at human remains that have been exhumed. There was an exhibit called Mummies, which offered museum goers, it visited a selected group of American cities, but it offered museum goers the chance to look inside of the mummies using 3D technology. Now, I'm not sure about you, but that's not how I want my grandmother to be looked at. And they were very excited because the 3D technology allowed them to look at mummified animals and burial goods that had accompanied the mummies themselves. But in what world would that be okay? So for the 18 mummies that were on display, I'm not sure there was consent given by any of the families to allow that to happen. And I think that's part of the challenge we have, is that you can go to 5 museums in Paris and see human remains on display. Not one of those institutions can explain to you the provenance of how they have come to have those ancestors and how the people feel about those ancestors being on display now. One of the challenges we face in dealing with museums is often over conflicting claims. So in British Columbia, where there are 204 First Nations, there is overlap shared territory. And the moment there is a contested claim over human remains or cultural patrimony of any kind, the museums no longer have to entertain that. So it's a tremendous, tremendous tactic for stalling repatriation efforts, is just to put forward an idea that there is a contested claim. To address that, in Michigan, there are 14 tribes who got together and said, none of us will contest the claim at the museum level. Instead, we'll take that back to our centralized organization and amongst ourselves decide where that piece of cultural patrimony or ancestor belongs. It's a much more efficient way of getting around the museum's tactics, but that's a very common one across the museum world.
Yeah, also I think I will come back to you. I think I think I agree with many things that when people are doing unethical things, of course that should simply be banned. But at the same time, I would not think that the serious scientists will go out there and collect something random, which is completely out of context, and then try to do something, because nothing can come out of it unless it's documented, unless it's contextualized. It will not have any scientific meaning. So most scientists who are serious will not really delve into the situation, in my opinion. Yes, please.
Go ahead. I never knew about repatriation until I got involved with the Ethiopian Museum here in Chicago, and ended up bringing back a lot of artifacts for this museum, and never really thought about it until Irene started getting involved. And thanks to her, we have this program tonight. So I would like us all to give Irene a big hand, okay? Really. But I represent tonight Ethiopian gentlemen in the Chicago community who could not be here tonight. And when I told him we were doing this program, he said, well, why are you going to return all of these things from the British Museum or the Smithsonian or any museum in the world back to Ethiopia when, number one, there is so much instability, and number two, when the museums there don't even take really good care of some of the artifacts they have. And he said, in fact, this is really an extreme position, but why not take all of the things from the museum in Ethiopia and put them in the West where they'll really be stable? And with technology today, just have virtual artifacts. And he said, wouldn't that be better in terms of, preserving them? So we have both extremes. We have on one side where they say everything should be returned, and on the other side, some people that say, no, ship everything to more stable countries.
Okay. Okay. We'll tag team this one.
So I don't know. He's going to say, well, what did the panel come up with? Where do people stand on this?
So if you don't, and then it's your turn. We're a team now. We can take the show on the road, maybe. First, I would say, look at the Parthenon Marbles, and if you can tell me the British government today is more stable than the Greek government sitting there right now, you can keep the marbles. I think even those of us from colonized cultures, and I would count myself among those, none of my great-grandparents were born in the nation-state of Greece. They were born in the Ottoman Empire. Some of us, decolonization is not just something that happens to other people. You have to decolonize yourself. And I think when you hear enough that your country or your culture is not as stable, is not as capable of taking care of their own patrimony or of themselves as the Western powers, you start to believe it. It is, I brought up that story about the British and the Germans forced the sale of Greek cultural heritage sites and then said, you may not have your statues back because you will sell them. I think that's an important indication of what that is. And a lot of colonialism, and this is all the legacy of colonialism. Make no mistake about that. This is just the reverberation. We're paying for the sins of our ancestors at this second. I'm a good Orthodox girl, so I don't believe in original sin, but I do believe in ancestral sin. Which is the idea. In the Eastern Church, it's different. So we don't believe you're born with a taint that needs to be washed off. But in the Eastern Church, we believe that our ancestors make decisions that make the world different for us to live in. It's not your fault, but it sometimes makes it easier to do bad things than good things. Okay. I think that's the language of colonialism. I think we've absorbed it even if we are the colonized culture. And the way to prove, first, I don't think you have to prove you deserve your own. That's like I could take better care of your china than you could. Give me your china, I'll take better care of it. You don't have to prove you can take care of your own stuff. You can take care of your stuff any way you want. But even then, I don't believe that, and I'll say one last thing. I don't believe that because I knew, and he's gone now, God rest his soul, I knew the director of the Iraqi National Museum, who was the director in 2003. And that man was in the midst of a country that had been at war for not just when we invaded in 2003, but for a decade before that. And he and his colleagues risked their lives to save the cultural heritage of the Iraqi people, cultural heritage that we stood back and allowed to be looted. So I don't think you have to prove you can take care of your own stuff, or everybody give me your stuff, I'll take better care of it, I promise. Probably right, Helene? And secondly, even if that's the test, there's no evidence of that except colonialism.
I'll just add to that. So I think one of the challenges is understanding how the museums have acquired the pieces that they've acquired. So if you have taken a piece of material culture because you enacted legislation which enabled you to do that, you don't have an ongoing right in perpetuity to hold on to that. I would also say that I can't speak for any other nation, but for the Klahus Nation, we're not always wanting to see every piece brought back to the territory. What we want to see is a change in ownership so that we have the right to interpret that piece, so we have the right to understand the exhibit and how that story is told. That if we took back every single piece and every First Nation took back every single piece of material culture, not only would the museums be empty, but we would create these insular communities that have no tolerance for one another. That there has to be a balance and understanding, but it starts fundamentally with understanding that Indigenous ownership doesn't change simply because the location of an artifact is outside of the traditional boundaries of the community. Mic drop.
I'm just curious that as this conversation around repatriation has increased in recent years, and there have been more requests on the part of communities that have had their goods taken, or whatever the case is, are there any particular institutions around the world that have been particularly forthcoming with those requests and being a little bit more progressive on this issue, or is there just sort of like a blanket, behavior within the museum institutions around the world to fight against this and that kind of thing?
So there are institutions which are doing things to decolonize the experience, and part of that is understanding they're striking Indigenous advisory councils and committees to help reinterpret museum collections, but lots of it pertains to how the museums have acquired the pieces. So if the pieces are given as a gift, they're more apt to return them back to communities. Where they've had to purchase them over whatever period of time, they're apt not to give them back. It's particularly challenging at the community level when we request a repatriation and what happens is a long-term loan. So allowing a colonial institution to maintain control and jurisdiction over an artifact. That is, well, on one side, welcome because a piece ends up back at the community, but at the same time, it is an extenuation of the paternalistic policies of colonial governments since they have first come to the shores. So we need to find the balance there. I don't think there's an institution you can point to and say they're doing a great job. I think lots of institutions are working to do a better job than they have, and we certainly enjoy much better relationships with the large. So the Royal British Columbia Museum was holding what they thought was somewhere around 350 sets of ancestors. There was over 740 sets of ancestors, and they have repatriated half of those ancestors back to the communities where they came from. So we're seeing movement, we're seeing progressive movement, but that's a common goal. We're looking at a long-term strategy, because if we took all of the First Nations material out of the Royal British Columbia Museum, their museum would be 3/4 empty. And so we have to figure out a way to balance the concerns of institutions who use First Nations material culture as a means of getting tourists in the door, versus making sure that the institutions that are in those communities, in First Nations communities, have the opportunity to get them back. That's about capacity building and funding and all sorts of things. So.
Okay, thank you. I just have to speak after hearing some Ethiopian person spoke about bringing all items from Ethiopia to be kept here. So I think I belong on the opposite side, and we really want to return our cultural heritage, and we want to get them back. I understand that there is a discussion and there are parts for this. So we are on the part of requesting this, but there is the other part that has to come to the table. So they have their own justification. I want to know what is their justification for keeping these items, materials. We know that culturally they belong to the different groups from whom it has been taken. And I just want to say that how much is enough? We are talking about cultural patrimony. I think someone should say what it means for some of us who are lay. But how much is enough? Now we are talking about cultural artifacts and so on. Today, as we speak, it is happening that there is genetic looting is happening in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a land of teff, which goes similar with coffee. And some companies have took the patent. This grain has been for 1,000 years in Ethiopia. It has been grown, and they took, I think it's in Europe, and they took the patent and they are keeping it. And now we are fighting in the international court to get back the patent to the original Ethiopians. So this has happened in the colonial period, but today biological things are happening. Genetic materials are being taken. How much is enough? So I think that kind of conversation should take place. Thank you.
Does anyone mind? So I want to first address that kind of question about how much is it. I didn't mean to snatch the mic out of your hand like that. Sorry, my manners. You'll repatriate the mic. It's a Greek mic. It belongs to the National Hellenic Museum. Just so you all know, I think that it's a complicated issue, but I actually think Hellenism gives us a way into this. So Hellenism is a concept really developed when Alexander the Great, who we'll talk about whether Macedonians are Greek or not, but we don't want to get into that. Literally, there were riots like last year about this, so we'll leave that alone. But when Alexander conquered not only the Greek peninsula, but territory as far west as far east as the Indus River Valley, the governments that were established, he died before he could govern them, really, but the flu. But the governments the successor kingdoms, the way they ruled they were linguistically and culturally Greek, but they also adopted the local customs. They kept the local aristocracy intact, and this idea of Hellenism evolved from that. And it was this idea that you're respectful of local custom, you learn, you take the best of what humanity has produced, and you share that with each other. And we can solve each other's problems, because if I haven't thought up the idea to fix that problem, maybe you have. And I think that's important. I think that idea that our common humanity requires us to meet each other and take what is best from all people, which was Aristotle's recommendation to his student Alexander, is important. I do think modern colonialism colors this. Because that wasn't kind of encountering what was best, that was just taking people's stuff. And that's very, very different. And there has to be, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a ratty-haired Greek girl who likes classics. But I do think there has to be a way of protecting traditional intellectual property as much as traditional artifacts. I don't think that means nobody gets to have olive oil ever because it was our idea, okay? Or maybe. But I do think it means that, you know, cultural appropriation is a real thing, and when you take people's, oftentimes when you take people's cultural patrimony, you also take their livelihoods, and you monetize something you have systemically kept the people who created it from monetizing. That's the injustice that needs to be addressed. It's not, I mean, I like TEF too. Like, I love I'm from Aurora, and there's a large Ethiopian community in Aurora, Colorado. I'm Orthodox, I grew up Orthodox before the Ethiopians had built their own churches. I went to church with a lot of Ethiopians. So I like Ethiopian food. I don't want you to take that away from me, but I do want to make sure that the people being compensated are, or at least some of the people being compensated, are the people at the origin point of that.
Thank you. I think unless there are some burning questions, there is one. Just maybe to add, because Ethiopia was mentioned, and also the notion of heritage in general. I think it's important to look at it, as we said various times now. There is the fact that it's owned by humanity. Yes, it's true, but also there is a subsidiary ownership to that specific object, where if it was to go out of that context, then it becomes meaningless, as I tried to say in my introductory spiel. But those who would tell you, oh, because you in Asia or Africa or elsewhere, because you cannot take care of your heritage, give it to us and we will show you what we can do with it. I think someone said it emanates from some historical way of thinking. Let's put it that way for now. I remember back about 15, 16 years ago, there were fossils. These are remains of non-Homo sapien species, could be elephants and all sorts of precious fossils. They were exported to France in 1930. And the government asked, can you please give us back? And they said, well, we would love to, but you don't have the facilities to take care of them. And within 3 or 4 years, this is 15 years ago, they built a 4-story building, which not only now houses those fossils from France, but is actually better than the conditions that the fossils were in France when they were. So that is just a good example of when governments want to do things, they can do it. But this is, of course, not a simple solution where you declare, I'm going to build a building. It's more complex than that. So for me, the takeaway would be, I think, a conversation, a humanistic approach to our heritages, and to be fair when we use those tools to tell stories is, in a way, doing justice to anyone and everyone involved. And I'm talking about the 7 billion people on Earth as I speak about that. But I would be remiss if I did not thank Irene again for doing all the work. Maybe she deserves a round of applause. The people who run this place also played a key role, so thank you. And of course, the 3 panelists, Jody, Eleanor, and Catherine, for giving us an insight in some of the most exciting stories about human heritage. Thank you.